Good morning, Facebook community, and welcome back to UCI Mind's monthly Facebook Live series, Ask the Doc, Alzheimer's Research Today. If this is your first time joining us, I'm Chelsea Cox. I'm the Associate Director of Education for UCI Mind. We are one of 32 Alzheimer's disease research centers across the country that is designated by the National Institutes of Health. And UCI Mind is located on UC Irvine campus in Orange County, California. And we really serve as the source of expertise for Alzheimer's research to the local community. And in this Open Ask the Doc seminar, we really bring the experts and the local expertise to you to be able to answer questions about current topics in Alzheimer's and dementia research. And today, I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Elizabeth Head. Welcome, Dr. Head.
Thank you.
Dr. Head will be discussing whether there's any promising vaccines for Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Head received her PhD in neuroscience from the University of Toronto, and she completed postdoc training right here at UC Irvine. Mm-hmm. And she comes back to us recently to UC Irvine from the University of Kentucky, and now serves as professor and vice chair for research in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine. Dr. Head has dedicated over 20 years and more than 150 publications to the field of brain aging and Alzheimer's disease, with a special focus on individuals with Down syndrome. And I look forward to talking to her a little bit more about that too. So thank you again, Dr. Head, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And, first, just to be sure, there are currently no vaccines or treatments, unfortunately, to prevent or delay Alzheimer's disease. Is that correct?
So far, that is correct. Yep.
Okay. Mm-hmm. But it's a significant focus for researchers here and really around the globe to discover these types of treatments that can eventually prevent or delay the disease onset. And vaccines are certainly a hot topic right now in the wake of a national measles outbreak. So, Dr. Head, just to begin, if you could tell me the basics about how a vaccine works to prevent disease in general, like the measles.
Sure. The simple way to think about a vaccine is that it's mimicking what happens to us when we develop an infection. So the way that our bodies respond when there's a bacteria or a virus that's causing an infection in our body, we produce antibodies that help to clear that infection away. And our body remembers how to do that. So there's a memory for those viruses and bacteria, and that memory is through antibodies that we make. Mm-hmm. So at some point in the future, if we're exposed to that same virus or something similar, our bodies are very quick to say, oh, I recognize it, I'm going to make those antibodies again. So a vaccine mimics that without having to go through the infection part of things. Mm-hmm. And so a vaccine might be a virus that's been deactivated, but it's similar enough to the live bacteria or a virus to stimulate our bodies to make antibodies. And that way we're making them for the rest of our lives. So our childhood vaccines, for example, we have a memory for those vaccines that last forever. Some of them need to be boosted at some point.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks, Dr. Head. And if you're just joining us, it looks like we have a few new people who've joined us today. And if you're new to this series, the way that it works is as questions come up, we welcome you to type them in the comments box, and Dr. Head will be happy to answer any questions that you have as they come up. But please do remember that whatever you type in the comments box will be visible to others and linked to your name. So Dr. Head, we just talked about how vaccines work to prevent disease in general. Mm-hmm. What work then has been done toward potential vaccines for Alzheimer's disease?
So that was a really fun kind of an interesting story to live through as a researcher. So the story kind of broke in 1999, and there was a researcher by the name of Dale Schenk in California at the Land Pharmaceuticals who came up with this idea, which at first we all thought was a little bit crazy, because what he was doing was he thought maybe we can stimulate the body to make an antibody against the protein that we see in senile plaques. Mm-hmm. So is
that the beta amyloid?
The beta amyloid peptide, exactly. So if we could stimulate our bodies to make our own antibodies for that protein, maybe that antibody will go into the brain and bind up the plaques and clear the plaques from your brain. Mm-hmm. So what was funny about that suggestion, besides it was very, very clever, is we didn't think it would work because antibodies are big, big, big proteins themselves, and it's hard for them to get into the brain and get past our blood-brain barrier, which protects our brain from infection, etc. And it turned out he was right, probably not for that reason, but the antibodies did indeed clear the plaques in mouse models that are mice that are engineered to look like they have Alzheimer's disease. So it worked really well in mice, and it gave them better memory. And so we were pretty excited, and that went right into clinical trials.
And this was in 1999?
In 1999 was the start of this, and clinical trials started, of course, a number of years later. But unfortunately, the very first trial that happened, there was a side effect that was not anticipated, which was kind of a swelling in the brain, and we had to stop that trial quickly. So we had to go back to the drawing board to figure out how could we do this. So I would have to say over the past 10 years or so, this has been the most exciting area of trying to develop clinical trials. The idea of being able to make a vaccine. So we've had a lot of successes. Every trial that we've run, we've learned a lot from. Unfortunately, they've not succeeded yet, but I know there's still an active area of trying to figure out how can we make a vaccine that doesn't have a lot of side effects, that works really well, and potentially that people could have before they get disease to prevent the disease.
So earlier this year, a Dublin-based company published promising results on a potential vaccine for Alzheimer's disease. Could you speak to that trial or other more recent vaccine trials that have shown promise? Like, what have some of the successes and challenges?
Sure.
What have those been?
So the sad news is that most of the clinical trials with vaccines have, I'm going to say the word fail. It's kind of a strong word. A lot of them have been stopped because there's been problems with the side effects. And those side effects include, as I mentioned, the swelling in the brain that can have clinical complications, and that tends to go away when you stop the vaccine. So, those have been kind of, I would say, the not so good outcomes of these clinical trials. On the other hand, there's been some successes. And some of the key successes with studies of vaccine clinical trials is we see that it is working to clear the plaques from the brain. It is reducing the amount of plaques in people's brains. So we just have to figure out, perhaps how to best administer those antibodies with fewer side effects. Then we flip over to the negative side again, and even though we're clearing those plaques from the brain, we're not seeing a lot of improvement in memory in people. So now the argument is, well, maybe we're coming in a little bit too late. Maybe we need to go earlier and prevent that memory decline. So there's lots of different angles to take, but the bottom line is every single clinical trial we do, we learn something incredibly useful that can be applied to the next clinical trial. So I think it's important to stay really optimistic and keep engaged because we need that teamwork to find an answer.
And you mentioned, possibly part of the challenge has been starting too late in the disease. How do we identify people earlier?
And that's another big challenge in the field is we don't have a blood test for Alzheimer's disease. We can do brain scans and it can tell us a lot, but it also can't necessarily say for sure somebody has Alzheimer's disease. We have to follow people for a little while. But I think if we were able to find a test that somebody could take perhaps in their 40s or 50s and that test says, yes, you're going to develop the disease, then a very good option potentially would be a vaccine at that point. So we got a ways to go yet, but those are really good questions to answer.
So vaccines have really saved a lot of people from life-threatening diseases. Do you think that a vaccine is going to be the solution to Alzheimer's?
That's a question I get asked a lot. I think Alzheimer's disease is so complicated. There are so many things going on in the brain that targeting just one problem, like beta amyloid plaques, may not do the trick, especially when somebody's a little further along in the disease. We may have to do combined treatments. So there's ideas like, what if we used a vaccine to clear the plaques, and then we used a drug to prevent those plaques from coming back? Okay. That's probably going to be more potent than just a vaccine. Or what if we can clear plaques with a vaccine and then try to get our brains to repair from the damage that we've gotten from those plaques through exercise or cognitive enrichment or some drug that stimulates those same benefits in your brain. So my personal opinion is it's going to be a part of the treatment and a part of the cure.
Okay. Now there's a question here from a viewer. Are there any clinical trials that are, you mentioned who focus on amyloid plaques.
Right.
Are there any clinical trials with a focus on tau? Attacking tau?
That's a great question. So
first, what is tau?
So tau is the protein that we see inside of tangles. And those tangles are inside of our neurons that really, it makes them very unhealthy and they can't talk to each other very well. And you need to have both plaques and tangles for a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And we were mostly focused on beta amyloid because in the progression of the disease, most folks, not everybody, believe that plaques come first and then they drive the tangles. But what is interesting is that we don't really see signs of dementia until the tangles kick in. So it's a viable target. So it's a really great question. And yes, there are folks working on antibodies for tangles and antibodies against tau, especially when that tau protein is really important for function in our brains, so we don't want to get rid of it. But when it becomes abnormal, as in Alzheimer's, it has a signature.
Is that true of amyloid too? Like we need some of it?
We need some, well, it's naturally produced. We don't know exactly what it does, but it's naturally produced. So there are lots of really good people and researchers working on different antibodies that'll recognize that abnormal tau and potentially clear it out. So those definitely are probably coming in the pipeline as soon as they get all of those pieces worked out.
Yeah, looks like we have another question here from a viewer. Good morning from on campus. Is there any testing for me since I have Alzheimer's in my family?
It depends. If we know that there are some kinds of Alzheimer's disease that are genetically driven, and those tend to happen when people are very young, much younger, 30s and 40s. But it does tend to run in families. And there's another risk factor called apolipoprotein E4 that is associated with higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. And you can get tested for that. There are companies that will test for that. What I would like to recommend, though, is if you're going to pursue that kind of line of inquiry, is you want to get the appropriate counseling when you get those results, because it's not easy to understand what a genetic mutation means versus a risk factor. And a risk factor means it doesn't say for sure you're going to get that disease, but your risk might be higher, but it still means you could get out to 90 without developing Alzheimer's, even with that risk factor. So yes, and in some ways you can get tested, but it might not give you the yes or no answer that you're looking for.
Yeah, and that's true, I believe, of the apolipoprotein E4 allele, that if you carry it, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll get the disease. Right. It may slightly increase risk, and people can get the disease who have no family history.
Exactly right. Although recognizing that there might be risk in your family, you could spin that to being a good thing. And that good thing might be you might spend more time trying to control all of your other risk factors for dementia, like making sure you get good exercise, you eat well, all those good things. So, use that information for your benefit.
Thank you. That's a very great response, and a couple of great questions. And if you are just joining us, just as a reminder, we welcome your questions as they come. So feel free to type questions into the comments box, and Dr. Head will be happy to answer them like she just did. Now, Dr. Head, your research specifically focuses on Alzheimer's disease in individuals with Down syndrome. Right. What are you learning with this population, and how might that help give us some answers toward improved treatments for the disease?
Sure. So I'm not sure if everybody knows what the link is between Down syndrome.
Maybe not, so it'd be great if you could explain.
Sure. So people with Down syndrome have an extra copy of chromosome 21. And on that chromosome is the gene for the amyloid protein. So that means that people with Down syndrome, even from the time they're born, are making too much beta amyloid protein. And that means usually by the time they're in their 30s, they start to make plaques in their brains. By the time they're 40, they have plaques and tangles. and in their 50s, a good number of them develop dementia. So what that means is that by working with people with Down syndrome, we have a much easier kind of target. We know what age different things are happening in their brains. So if we wanted to develop a way to prevent or treat Alzheimer's disease, we can target different ages in people with Down syndrome. Compare this to the general population. If we wanted to run a prevention study in the greater population, we'd have to recruit hundreds of thousands of people, and we still don't know who's going to develop disease. And the age of onset of that disease is quite variable. It can be 60 to 100. So the story is a little simpler in people with Down syndrome. So what that means for us, and I hope for them, is that we have a better chance of doing some of our first prevention studies for people with Down syndrome. I think that's going to be something that's in the near future. And what we learn from doing those studies in people with Down syndrome, we hope will translate out to everybody. So it's just that the story is a little bit easier to wrap our heads around in people with Down syndrome. It is, exactly. Yeah.
Are there any current trials that are going on to look at preventative therapies?
In people with Down syndrome? So the sad news, and one of the reasons why we're so passionate about this question is in clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease, people with Down syndrome are excluded. So they're an underserved group of people who are at very high risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. There is one study that will be recruiting, which is a vaccine study.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
okay.
Coming out of, I believe, in California through Mike Raffy's group. So that should be on the radar very soon and is active. So we're thinking about it. And it gets a little complicated in people with Down syndrome because there are lots of genes that are overexpressed. It's not just that one. So we just have to be cognizant that whatever treatment we think about might have other targets that we're not predicting because of that extra copy of chromosome 21.
Okay. Now, you talked a little bit about your role as an Alzheimer's researcher and looking at population, the Down syndrome population. What other roles do you play at UCI Minds Alzheimer's Disease Research Center?
So one of the fun things, well, it depends on your perspective, one of the fun things I do like to do besides work on the Down syndrome program is I help run the brain tissue repository so that when people are followed in clinic here through our center and through our Alzheimer's Disease Center, if they're kind enough to donate their brains for research purposes, I'm the one that helps organize that with my team, which I have a great team. And it's one of those things, it's the gift that keeps on giving. So we keep samples for a lot of years, and we share those samples with people around the world. So it's a very satisfying job. We've learned an awful lot by studying the brains of people who've come to autopsy. So we appreciate that, what the families do for us. And we need to study the brain to understand what's going on, what's changing, and more importantly, to figure out what's our next treatment target. You know, we have to keep ahead of the game and keep trying new things until we get that hit. And we still have, people who are in mild to moderate phases of dementia, and we don't, we can manage the disease at that point, but it'd be awfully nice if we could figure out a way to really impact the quality of their lives. So doing these autopsy studies are critically important. I also do a lot of education as well, which is another one of my passions. I am very excited to get the next generation of scientists up in a big wave behind us to take all this over, because each of us has stood on the shoulders of other people. And I think that's another thing where Mind really excels, is in mentoring up junior people and putting them out into the community as our next high impact researchers.
Well, that's wonderful, and very, as you know, in education myself, something I find very important and necessary to help move the field forward. Looks like we have another question here. The viewer commented, I've heard the study of the brain after death due to Alzheimer's is very important. So just like as you were talking about, what can be learned from that compared to studies on living people?
Very good. We can do a lot of studies in people when they're still alive, especially when we look at neuroimaging like MR, magnetic resonance imaging, or PET scans. We can learn a lot from those things. But what we can't learn is kind of a lot about what proteins are changing in the brain that we don't have ways to see when somebody's alive, or maybe those proteins are not something that we can see in the blood or that we can see in cerebrospinal fluid. So, we can learn an awful lot by watching people and following people, but in the end, we still don't know. I'll give you an example. Let's say oxidative damage is a big part of driving Alzheimer's disease, and we can measure some of those things in the blood. But the real way we can measure it is by looking in the brain and look for proteins that are damaged by oxidative stress. And then we can come up with ideas, well, what if we use an antioxidant? Or what if we specifically fix that protein? Is that a way to go? So I wish we could do these things without autopsy, but it's critically important for us at this point to really look at the brain tissue. And then that this field evolves so quickly. Then there's so many good people here at UC Irvine that are bringing all these brand new methods to the table to start answering really complicated questions that we couldn't answer before. And this is where the autopsy studies are important, because we still have brain tissue that we collected 20 years ago that can be applied to this question.
Another question here, is there a particular percentage of brain shrinkage associated with an Alzheimer's disease diagnosis? So I think this person is referring to like MRIs.
MRI.
Yeah.
There is, and I don't remember what the percentage is exactly, and I believe we have a talk coming up on that soon.
We do, actually.
Yeah.
In August.
In August.
We have a specific topic. So it's the first Friday in August. Is that correct, Kirsten? Yeah. Where the topic will be whether brain scans can help diagnose Alzheimer's disease. So we'll definitely address that question more specifically then. And we also have a topic specifically on what we learned from brain donation with Dr. Ed Minucci. So please do keep an eye out for those upcoming topics. Now, Dr. Head, I'm always curious to ask how our brilliant researchers came to be interested and study and focus their careers and dedicate their lives to learning about Alzheimer's disease. How did you come?
How did I come about that? That came about through my interactions with other researchers and other scientists. So, growing up in Canada, of course, I didn't have anybody in the family who was showing signs of dementia, so I didn't have a personal pull that way. But as I was going along in my career, I became more and more fascinated by the brain and how it worked, and especially how it didn't work when it was broken. And when I came to UC Irvine to do a postdoc, I met Dr. Ira Lott, who's a pediatric neurologist, and Dr. Lott was really interested in Down syndrome. And it was him that inspired me to kind of pursue this, and I've never looked back. I think it is just the most fantastic area of study, and I think by working with people with Down syndrome, we can also, like I said, give a lot of information out to everybody who might be affected by Alzheimer's disease. So a lot of it is curiosity and inspiration from other people, and that's exactly what I'm hoping to give to that next generation as well, and keep them going.
Yeah, and there's definitely a lot of researchers here at UCI Mind to be inspired by.
Oh boy, yeah. There's nothing like coming to a place where everybody is that passionate about the topic. It's a really wonderful place.
Yeah. And just kind of lastly to wrap up here, unless we get some other questions from the community, but I'm wondering what you find most exciting about the current state of Alzheimer's research.
I think the thing I'm most excited about right now is how much progress we've made on finding biomarkers.
Okay, and what is a biomarker?
So biomarker is something that we can measure that, be it usually non-invasively, be it through blood, say cerebrospinal fluid, or from brain imaging, that's telling us about what's going on in the brain and whether or not it predicts someone is developing Alzheimer's disease.
Okay.
And then the second part of that biomarker story is if we do a clinical trial, we need to know what to measure in the blood or through brain imaging to say that that treatment works. So I think that's where the most energy is being put right now, because I think we're all recognizing the best way we're probably going to reduce the number of people affected by Alzheimer's disease is to prevent it.
Yeah.
And that's where the biomarker story is really important. So there are some great researchers doing work in this area. So the biomarker approach, but also I really find the precision medicine approach appealing. I like the idea that for each person, we can figure out what their risk factors are,
Mm-hmm.
and then think about what is a way that we can work with that person to reduce their risk and hopefully go on to a long life without dementia.
Yeah, and this goes back to identifying people early.
Yeah. But as I said, we don't want to lose focus on people who have disease. You know, there's a lot there we can do that we need to do to continue making their lives better.
Yeah, and there are active clinical trials here at UCI Mind in individuals with mild cognitive impairment or early Alzheimer's disease to try to identify potential improved treatments or disease delaying therapies for Alzheimer's disease. So, Dr. Head, it was an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you for taking the time to come in and talk to the Facebook community about this very interesting and hot topic of vaccines and Alzheimer's disease. And if you'd like to learn more about Dr. Head's research and the research of other faculty members at UCI Mind, you can visit our website at mind.uci.edu. And, you know, researchers are always looking to partner with community members to help us find improved treatments and prevention for Alzheimer's disease. So if you are interested in participating in research or you'd like to learn more about what you might qualify for, you can visit the UCI Consent to Contact Registry, which is an online tool to match people with research studies that are happening at UCI. And the registry can be found at c2c.uci.edu. And then similar to this Facebook Live series here, we actually host an in-person quarterly Ask the Doc program and seminars throughout the Orange County community. So if you're local, our next seminar is going to be on June 13th at the Bowers Museum in Santa Ana, and I believe registration is live for that right now on the Bowers website, so you can visit the Bowers website to register for that seminar. And then there will also be an Ask the Doc seminar in August that has a special focus on Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease, and Dr. Head will be one of the panelists for that special seminar. So I encourage you to attend that if you have more questions about Alzheimer's disease, Down syndrome, related dementias, brain health, treatments, and all of those things. So again, Dr. Head, thank you very much. And thank you, Facebook community, for joining us today. Please do tune in again next month. The first Friday of June is June 7th at 9 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. I'll be joined by Dr. Mark Mapstone, who will discuss biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease like we talked about, and specifically blood tests for the disease and where research is headed in that particular area. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.